Hi, everyone. My name is Patrick Cohn. I'm a pharmacy major, and I'll be graduating in 2022, and I'm the SGI president this year. And to make this session as accessible as possible for people who are listening, myself and everyone else will be speaking. We'll be doing our introductions and describing ourselves physically. So I'm a white young man. I have short brown hair and a mustache, and I'm wearing a plaid button-down shirt and jeans. And my affirming pronouns are he, him, and his.
I find this series and this topic really important because it takes a decision to work against racism. I can say that my whiteness and my upbringing in an area where almost everyone around me was white biased the information that was available for me to come up with the ideas that have shaped every aspect of my life. I realized growing into adulthood, something that was said really well by Dr. Robin DiAngelo in her video that was in the resources for this session, that the default of our society is the reproduction of racism. And if we just live our lives and carry on the most comfortable way for us, we will necessarily reproduce it. It's easy to do nothing about racial inequity. It's especially easy for me because I'm white and I can choose to live my life without thinking about it. But if nothing is done, then nothing will change. So it takes thoughtfulness and effort and education and conversations like this one to work against that. And I'm really happy today that we can go into the construct of whiteness and afterwards try to take a more educated perspective into the rest of our lives. And now, Julia.
Thanks, Pat. Hi, everyone. So my name is Julia Spencore. I am a journalism major at Collins College of Professional Studies, and I'll be graduating in May 2022. And I am the Vice President of Student Government this year. I'm a mixed-race Puerto Rican woman. I have light brown skin and dark brown curly hair. I'm wearing a red blazer today, and my pronouns are she, her. And as a BIPOC woman, the importance of the series that sits with me is the necessity for our university community to discuss how to fight racism together. And that requires for students and faculty, staff, alumni, and administration to deeply analyze racism and its foundations and how they're reflected in our everyday lives and in our workplaces. I come from a majority white neighborhood out in Long Island. I attended a majority white school district. And so whiteness has placed a lot of division in my life, in my experience, while growing up in those two communities, because the idea of whiteness affects BIPOCs in our personal lives, where my sense of belonging as a BIPOC woman was predetermined because of the difference in my appearance. So something that I want to keep in the back of my mind during this conversation is how the construct of whiteness has delegated the privileges that I have and don't have. Appearance-wise, one of my privileges is that I'm a light-skinned woman because of my whiteness. But even though I am mixed and I have European DNA, my privilege is still capped at a certain point because while my skin is light, it is also brown. So while speaking about the construct of whiteness, I want to keep in mind that much like how privileges are granted to us, the oppression that I face as a BIPOC woman is also delegated to me and for me. So while mentioning privilege, I want to note that I'm aware that most of the participants in this conversation are white and/or white passing. And so there's a lot of privilege that exists within this conversation itself. And there are many experiences in lives that are impacted by the construct of whiteness that are not visually present right now. But I'm excited for us to dive into the construct of whiteness together. And these sessions are a starting point that we must hold ourselves accountable to continue these conversations and how we fight racism at our university.
Okay, so welcome everyone again to the second session of the Racial Justice Conversations, Becoming Agents of Change. Today's topic is the construct of whiteness. Every 2 weeks, we'll be presenting a different topic to enrich the knowledge and understanding about racial justice topics. It was the purposeful intention of the committee to identify panelists, moderators, and openers who are diverse in identity and experience, whose lived experiences and/or scholarship deem them experts, and whose individual narratives can serve as windows and mirrors of our own. Today's panelists are brave, committed, and open to both having and leading these racial justice conversations. We thank them and you. We hope that you are able to review the recommended resources so we can have an informed and fruitful conversation. Now for some housekeeping notes. Everyone will be muted and no videos are enabled except for the moderator and discussants. We recommend using the active speaker view, watching this on WebEx. For the sake of time, we will not read bios. Bios are located on the website at stjohns.edu/racialjustice, along with photos of our guest panelists, moderators, and openers and closers. All questions may be posted in the Q&A tab. When sending your questions, please select hosts, not hosts and presenters, to have your questions added to the queue. Your questions will be interwoven within the conversation as deemed appropriate by the committee. Questions that pertain to topics of other sessions within this series will be held for those sessions. It is our hope that unanswered questions will be gathered and addressed in future conversations. Conversation in the chat is encouraged. We have hidden the guest count, although I'm happy to report that we have many people registered for today's session. Please enjoy the public chat feature while knowing that the Q&A is private. This discussion is being recorded, so it can be posted on the St. John's website and shared with others who are not available during this time to be part of the discussion. If you're having any technical difficulties, please message the hosts.
Thanks, Pat. So our moderator for today's session is Matthew Putrelli, PhD. Dr. Putrelli leads the Office of Global Programs, where he oversees the university's sites abroad and the Office of International Education. He also works with colleagues to envision and administer comprehensive internationalization efforts and with universities worldwide to create sustainable new partnerships. Additionally, Dr. Putrelli serves as the proud advisor of Spectrum, the university's LGBTQ+ student group.
Thank you, Patrick and Julia. Listening to students like you gives me such confidence in our country's future, which is a great place to start a discussion like this. And you'll see that I'm going to end in a similar vein too. I'm Matt Putrelli. I'm male, white, and have brown hair, and I'm wearing a blue shirt with a plaid tie. My pronouns are he and his. It's really a pleasure to be with all of you today and with today's discussants. I've been asked to omit most thank yous and introductions, so I'm going to limit myself to thanking the organizers of today's events and my co-panelists. These discussions are urgent, and it's a really big deal that we're having them at St. John's. They're, as I'm going to quote Julia here, they're a starting point that we must hold ourselves accountable to. I thought that was just perfectly said. So thank you for your leadership, those who are organizing and making this happen. So welcome again to today's session, The Construct of Whiteness. If you saw the name of this session and asked yourself, why do we need a panel about whiteness? Isn't this a series about race? Then you're in the right place. Today, we're going to attempt to explain both how and why whiteness, as this broad racial category, operates and works, and why we white people often don't really see ourselves as having a race. I'm going to start with a quick story, or hopefully a quick story. I was watching a documentary recently about the recording of a cast album. It was filmed in 1970, so 50 years ago. And forgetting the music and the actual content, two things stood out. First, there was a ton of smoking all the time, ash hanging from cigarettes as folks belted out tunes. It was a different era. But much more problematically and much more germane to today's conversation, there was this very overt sexism, women being talked down to, corrected differently, spoken at and to differently. And if I think about a time machine and I asked the folks who were present that day, asked the men, are you treating women differently? I think they probably would have said no. If I asked the women, are you being treated differently? I think a lot of them would have said yes. But what I'm most confident of is that most people attending today's session, both men and women, would see exactly what I saw, and that you likely can think of other examples in the culture yourself. I always come to Bang Zoom, Straight to the Moon, Right in the Kisser as one example that is very dated, but still a lot of you know what I'm talking about. This just wouldn't be funny anymore. And I'm not suggesting sexism is over, but I am saying that behaviors that would have been normal / invisible at a certain time have somehow become more visible and less accepted. So what's my point? Well, to be honest, I'm speaking mostly to skeptical white people right now. In order to engage this discussion seriously, we first have to acknowledge that our view of the world may be incomplete. Not because we're ill-intentioned or we're bad people, but because we're human beings. And as was pointed out really well in the first session, culture is invisible, and the context of whiteness is itself a cultural creation. Now, particularly when a cultural construct benefits us, we often fail to see it. It may only be visible when someone points it out to us, and then only when our minds are open enough to pay attention. It's like that old joke about two fish, and one turns to the other and says, the water's great today. And the other says, what's water? Or on a much more serious note, it's like when many of us white people finally noticed the murder of George Floyd and became outraged. And when most of Black America wondered how we only managed to see now when this story was far from new. What keeps us from noticing water? Before we get into cisgendered, white, gay guy, born to a family of mixed politics, which means that we've got very committed Biden supporters and very committed Trump supporters. And I guess I'm hoping that my experience of kind of trying to straddle that divide personally will help me connect to those of you who may disagree with many aspects of my politics, but who might still understand that we all have to engage with this anti-racist movement for us to make necessary progress as a nation. To tackle that idea head on, I'm going to address the recent White House directive against conversations like these. I don't know how many of you saw it, but it was also echoed in a conservative column. And anyway, just to encapsulate it, both of these characterize those of us who believe in this fight as viewing the United States as rotten to its core, as irredeemable, as not worth protecting or bettering. But the reality is, we couldn't be coming, at least most of us, from a more different place. And to get that point across, I'm going to actually quote Barack Obama at the Democratic National Convention. By the way, this is a point he's made before, and a point many other, particularly BIPOC folks, have also made before. So here's the quote. "Whatever our backgrounds, we're all the children of Americans who fought the good fight. Great-grandparents working in fire traps and sweatshops without rights of representation, farmers losing their dreams to dust, Irish and Italians and Asians and Latinos told to go back where they came from, Jews and Catholics, Muslims and Sikhs made to feel suspect for the way they worshiped, Black Americans chained and whipped and hanged, spit on for trying to sit at lunch counters, beaten for trying to vote. If anyone had a right to believe that this democracy did not work and could not work, it was those Americans, our ancestors. They were on the receiving end of a democracy that had fallen short all their lives. They knew how far the daily reality of America strayed from the myth. And yet, instead of giving up, they joined together and said, somehow, some way, we are going to make this work. We are going to bring those words in our founding document to life." It's in the spirit of what I'm kind of identifying in Obama as a radical optimism that we hope today's conversation reaches our whole audience. But if I'm being honest, specifically white people who may doubt this project. We welcome the choir, we need the choir, we love the choir, but we're not here to preach to them alone. We also want to reach those, like the commentators on the Robin DiAngelo video we shared, who think questions around whiteness or white privilege are politically correct nonsense at best and deeply harmful at worst. We welcome you, and frankly, we need you. You are, after all, members of my family, almost literally. So for our first discussant, I'm going to turn it over to Joanne Carroll. Dr. Carroll is a faculty member in the College of Pharmacy and Health Sciences. And the question I want to ask Dr. Carroll Joanne, is how does white privilege manifest itself, and where do you see the construct of whiteness?
Thank you, Matt, and thanks to all the organizers and discussants. I come to this conversation as an older white woman in her 60s who was raised in the 1960s, a time when the demands for racial equality and Black-white tensions were apparent even to me as a child. Televised reports of demonstrations with dogs and fire hoses to control protesters, housing redlining, dividing neighborhoods, including the one I grew up in, desegregation that required the National Guard, Black children attempting to integrate schools being met with angry, vicious abuse by white citizens, the assassinations of a president and numerous prominent civil rights leaders in quick succession during the decade, 3 in the course of the year 1968. There was also the March on Washington, the bus boycott, the Selma to Montgomery March, the Freedom Riders, the civil rights legislation, the Black Power movement, affirmative action. It is a very vivid set of memories for me, and yet it was followed by a long interval in my own life between then and when I began to realize later in life that the work was not done. I began to observe again and question. Racial issues for many whites faded into the background in this after time, as James Baldwin calls it. Other concerns were foregrounded. In 2020, we come back, and the events of this past summer have jolted many more people into recognizing that we have a problem. And these problems were perhaps invisible to some, but not to everyone. Rather than focus on the big picture issues, which are really important. I want to really encapsulate it down to an incident that I had in class this summer, in a summer school class in public health. And it brought the experience of whiteness and its privilege close to home for me. In the class, I presented a short video from the Southern Poverty Law Center, a civil rights organization that fights for racial justice. In the video, it demonstrated how Google algorithms tailor the responses to one's previous search history and therefore provide biased results. In other words, it gives me what I'm expecting to see. The example used relates to the Southern Poverty Law Center work that discovered in examining the history of Dylan Roof's computer prior to his murderous rampage in Charleston. As a progressive white woman, self-described progressive and liberal, I saw the emphasis on the importance of knowing your sources and a dramatic example of how a biased search result solidifies prejudices and hate. When the video ended, a student spoke up and asked, how could I use such an example? It was insensitive to this moment and to the students, especially Black students, who had been so impacted by recent events. The killing of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and Breonna Taylor, to name a few. In the moment, quick reactions flashed through my mind, along with many conflicting thoughts, like, but that's not the main point. That's not what I meant. But I did not speak. I stumbled. I wasn't sure what to say or what to do. When I did speak, I knew it was important to affirm that student's courage to speak out. The point I was using this for was not the point that was impacting the students, some of the students most strongly. I had been blind to the unintended consequence. I did acknowledge my error. I admitted I did not have a ready answer. And I promised I would reflect on it more and invited the class to think about what was raised. I corresponded with the student outside of class. In fact, she was reaching out to me at the same time, and our emails passed in cyberspace. The event further prompted me to think about addressing racism as a public health issue and planned a discussion later in the semester. I also sought the guidance of Manoushka Casimir, a colleague, and as you know her, the director of the Academic Center for Equity and Inclusion. We co-facilitated that discussion on racism as a public health issue later in the semester. I offer this example because I think we are in a time now when we all need to pay attention, to be deliberate, to expand our vision and to include other perspectives, and perhaps most importantly, to listen. Do I see racism, privilege, oppression, dominance, equity, and inclusion in my life, in the major events in the water that we all live in, and in my day-to-day interactions in my own personal life? There are consequences of our actions and our words that we may not anticipate because of our individual construction and our position in society. However, if we create a safe space for challenging each other, across all kinds of hierarchies, we can learn and we can hopefully change. The incidents in class was really uncomfortable, but incredibly valuable. I am not done with my education. I am sure I will fail again, and I hope I have someone like that student to call it out. I have much to learn, we all have much to learn, if we truly want racial justice. The country has faced moments like this in the past when truth and reconciliation were possible, but it was not realized. The first Reconstruction after the Civil War, the Second Reconstruction following the Civil Rights Movement and the Black Power Movement in the 60s. We are in another such moment now. Reverend William Barber, whom you may have heard last year on campus, calls this the Third Reconstruction. Will we finally commit to the work needed to deconstruct and dismantle the dominance and power that shapes our individual and collective experience? I'll close with the words of James Baldwin, who in 1972 reflected on the Black Power movement. And he said, quote, "As the Black glorifies in his newfound color which is his at last, and asserts, not always with the greatest politeness, the unanswerable validity and power of his being, even in the shadow of death. The white is very often affronted and very often made afraid. And one may indeed be wary. But the point is that it was inevitable that Black and white should arrive at this dizzying height of tension. Only when we have passed this moment will we know what our history has made of us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joanne. I really appreciate your sharing that story from class. I think it's incredibly relevant to lots of folks in the meeting today, so thank you for that. I just wanted to quickly answer one audience question that's easy. And the question is, what is Bi Poc? The answer is that's an acronym that stands for Black, Indigenous, and People of Color. Again, Bi Poc, Black, Indigenous, and People of Color. And now I'm going to turn it over to Caroline Fuchs. She is an Associate Dean and Learning Design Librarian within the university libraries. And the question I want you to think about is actually the same. How does white privilege manifest itself, and where do you see that construct of whiteness in your own life?
Sorry, I was having trouble unmuting technology. So thank you, Matt, and thank you, Carol, Joanne, for bringing me into my section here. So I'm Caroline Fuchs. I am a white female who came to consciousness in the 1970s. And today I have short gray hair. I'm wearing a white dress with a black floral print and have on my reading glasses. My pronouns are she, her, hers. So I need to be mindful of the construct of whiteness, not only as it is evident in the big events and the catastrophic things that occur and get covered in the news, and I'm not trying to disparage the importance of that coverage, but I really want to focus on the ways in which the construct of whiteness, white privilege, racism is present in little ways in our daily lives. And by little, I mean ways in which it often goes unseen. So I'm not meaning unimportant. I was made acutely aware of my own white privilege and the construct of whiteness a long time ago when I taught social studies in English to people of color who were predominantly 7th and 8th graders. And I was faced with a very uncomfortable dilemma. New to teaching, I had to figure out how I was going to teach American history using textbooks and teaching materials that presented US history from a very privileged white male perspective. Where were the other voices present in that narrative? The narrative in the books that I was given to teach with were biased. The history was white-centric. It was off-kilter. And I didn't know what to do about it. And the same was happening when I was teaching literature in English classes. So to reference Robin DiAngelo, this related to the fact that I had lived in segregation, her words, until this moment. I had been enculturated into white supremacy through my family, my friends, my education. And I was so unaware of this that I was unaware that this was even a thing. I didn't have the language to talk about it. I just knew that I was confronting a problem. And the reality I was facing was the forceful reality of white privilege. It was painfully obvious to me, but this reality seemed to go unseen, not only by me up until this point, but also by my colleagues, my friends, and my family. And I was struck and stuck. And this is pre-internet ubiquitousness. So this is not something where I could go online, create my own materials. This was a real problem for me. So I worked as best I could with, and I reached out to parents and grandparents of my students and asked them for ideas. And at first I had to get through a lot of who do you think you are kinds of questions that I really wasn't expecting. I don't know, I living in a bubble. Before I was even aware of the concept of ally, again, I didn't know what the vocabulary was. I was trying to figure out how I could use my own white privilege. Again, I didn't have the vocabulary to do something, to make some significant changes for the students, for the community with whom I was working. I do need to emphasize here that part of my own white privilege is that I got to choose to do this work, that this was an option for me, where the students in my class were facing this on a daily basis. Their parents, their grandparents had faced this, and it was so very new to me. Again, going back to D'Angelo's comments. So I tend to answer questions by asking more questions. It's kind of a thing. And the only way I know how to challenge my own white privilege is to remember to challenge my assumptions. So I continue to wonder, where else does white privilege go unseen in my life? Where are my blinders? What standards am I using to measure beauty, language, literature, art, music, success, and behavior? How is the construct of whiteness present in the way we interact with one another? And because we are at a university, in how we teach and how we interact with our students and how we allow our students to interact with one another. And the next question I need to ask myself and challenge myself on is, what am I going to do about it? So I need to approach this work with humility. I need to be willing to lean into discomfort and uncomfortable reality, the uncomfortable reality of white supremacy. For me, this is a continuous journey. I am honored to be part of this conversation, and I thank you for including me in this.
Thank you, Caroline. I'm really struck by your point about not having the vocabulary, and I'm hoping that the broader series, it gives people the ability or the words they need to kind of begin thinking about these in a more structured and hopefully ultimately activist way, which I think we'll talk more about as the discussion continues now. I'm going to turn it over to Victoria O'Keefe, who is the campus minister for social justice. And the question for you, Victoria, is how do faith and faith-based institutions play a role in propagating racism or white privilege? And what role can these same institutions or traditions play in being a part of an anti-racist future?
Hi, everyone. My name is Victoria, and I am a white female, currently wearing a pink floral shirt. I have brown hair, curly hair, green eyes, and I come from Long Island, which is a place that you can largely tell someone's class and or race just by knowing the town in which they come from. And so I'm looking forward to speaking today of how faith and faith-based institutions connect to the construct of whiteness and also anti-racism work. Whether we look at history, sociology, anthropology, all the different humanities, we can understand the effects that religion and faith traditions play in the story of the human race. There's an interesting bit on the New York Times too, which actually says that our days of worship can often be our most segregated hours. And at St. John's University, we are a faith-based community. There's 82% of our, students who ascribe themselves to a faith tradition or religion. The large portion of them being Catholic. And for our paid employees, over 53% of them are Catholic. And so for the sake of time, I'll focus on the Catholic piece of our mission and how this identity affects how we function and how it is comprised in a system and structure of our nation and of our world. And so if we want to have an honest look at the construct of whiteness and how Catholicity plays a role in that,
We can start by acknowledging that sexism, racism, and colorism often have been faith exports in the history of our country. And so for the Catholic piece, how the Catholic Church has enabled white privilege, the construct of whiteness, has been in the infrastructure of buildings that were done on the backs of slavery, colonization, and the extinction of indigenous peoples through religious movement of the Catholic Church, and marginalization of people of color. And if we look at continued effects of the Catholic Church even today, we could look at aid and development work and how often the intention may be good, but the impact has been detrimental to communities of color. That often the Eurocentric way of prayer is the right way of prayer, and that there's a lack of representation in elected leadership and continued failure to speak and act radically as our gospel calls us to as Catholics. So how can the church be both the oppressor and the oppressed? I think Father Augustus Tolton, who was the first Black Catholic priest in the United States, is a good example. He had this discernment and call to serve those in the Catholic Church and all that it served, not based on creed, but on need. Yet he had to go to the other side of the world to receive his formation and training because he wasn't allowed to enter seminary here in the United States, having been Black. And so how can the church be oppressor and oppressed? The answer is simple. It's because the church is human. But if we really look at the place in which we could gather our faith traditions, we could see it as a place in which we can have reconciliation, hope, and we could work for justice. When I consider my own white privilege and where I'm called to act in justice and mercy, interfaith scripture reminds me of the different texts that call us to the work in racial justice. So in the book of Leviticus in the Torah, we have the golden rule of treat others the way you would like to be treated. In Muhammad, peace be upon him, his farewell sermon speaks Arab, non-Arab, Black or white, none are superior to the other. And for our own Christian tradition, we know in the Beatitudes, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. I think diverse lived examples too can help guide us. Jesus, Gandhi, MLK, Dorothy Day, Fannie Lou Hamer, Daisuke Ikeda, Clara Lemlich, Cesar Chavez, Dolores Huerta, all these people were very influential and effective leaders of civil rights and of justice, and they relied heavily on their faith. And so today, in the feast day of St. Peter Claber, I hope that we could come together to reflect on our own privileges and the way in which we are called and demanded by our respective faith traditions to work for justice. If we don't see right now that our Black community is suffering and that our work that we are called to by God is there, then we're just failing to really live up to our identity as faith-filled people. Thank you.
Thank you, Victoria, and thank you particularly for tying this to our mission. I mean, I think being able to consider, Catholicity through a lens of kind of radical inclusivity and activism is really powerful for me too. You know way more about this than I do, so it's very informative for me. Our next discussant is Linda Romano. She's the Director of Digital Communications. And my question for you, Linda, or our question for you is, what is the relationship between the individual, meaning those of us who think of ourselves as not racists, and the system, which nonetheless has racist outcomes?
Hi, Matt, and thank you so much. Thanks to all my fellow panelists. I really want to thank my colleagues and community members who are with us today, who are Black and non-Black people of color, for being here and being willing to listen. Because for me, what's most frustrating in conversations on racism and anti-racist work is how committed we still are to centering white people and whiteness. So having an entire session about whiteness, to me, is an incredible and gracious gift, and I don't want to squander that, and I just want to say that I recognize that and I appreciate that. So my goal today is to share my own experiences and also be willing to be jolted out of assumptions or misconceptions that I have by questions and comments. And then when this is over, it's pretty simple. I want to shut my mouth and get to work. I want to decenter whiteness on an individual, family, community, and systems level. And that's what I'm personally committed to very deeply and very imperfectly in my own life. So an area of focus for me is really understanding the ways in which individuals and systems interact and how white people's individual awareness is essential to creating systemic change. And I want to talk a little bit about that phrase systemic racism, because I think it evokes, and I know it evokes a response in white people. And what tends to happen is that we ignore the system part and we become overly fixated on the racism part. And it's really important to understand those words in concert, because then our individual role in that systemic racism becomes clear. And there's tension between who we are as individuals and the system that we live in, and that's okay. I connect to this tension very much via my own personal story and the narrative of my family, which is very much focused around the immigrant experience. My whole life, I carried around with me the notion that people in my family made great sacrifices to come to this country, and I felt a personal obligation to make good on those sacrifices, to be high achieving, to ensure that those sacrifices were worth it, to work very hard, and to sort of pay forward the gift that my family who came before me gave to me. So to be very clear, I wasn't walking around thinking of myself as a bad person. I certainly wasn't thinking of myself as a racist person, but if I look back and I'm really honest with myself, I was ignorant for way too long. And ignorance made me at best complacent and at worst complicit in our system and our country's natural tendency to look out for me because I'm white at the expense of other people. It took me way too long to realize that I had this incredible luxury and that my whiteness gave me and still gives me the space to chart out my course for myself and doesn't limit me. Have breathing room to be more in control because I'm working inherently through a system that's working in my favor. So having this realization 100% created discomfort and tension in me, like 100% made me feel all sorts of feelings, made me feel all sorts of bad feelings, uncomfortable feelings. And like most people, I think my first impulse was to move myself away from the discomfort. And that is another sure sign that my whiteness is creating a systemic advantage. I can opt in to being uncomfortable. I am able to opt into discomfort. If I wanted to, I could leave this panel today and never ever spend another minute thinking about systemic racism because I have privilege and because the system will never force me to. Because that's the thing about systems, they protect themselves. They're not motivated to change because even the most screwed up system still accomplishes something, and it's in a system's best interest to preserve that, even if it's harmful to a large majority or a large group of people. So if the system is working for you, you'll never really be able to passively understand where it's broken. And this is where the relationship between the individual and the system becomes really interesting for me. Individuals have to make an active choice to say, no, we don't want this. We demand better. We will not accept the harmful and violent outputs of a broken system. But it takes the people for whom the system is working the best to demand that change and to be individually accountable for breaking down the destruction that we create through our ignorance. So this is a tension that white people have to balance. And we have to sit with it and stare down and confront, and most importantly, not let ourselves off the hook for, because that's a key part of this. You have to create a sort of system overload where all of a sudden the system recognizes that there's dysfunction happening in multiple touch points and that there's enough of a critical mass of people who are saying this is broken, this is not working, that the system is forced to change. So that's a topic that's really most interesting to me, and it's the work that I try to do myself, is recognize my own individual advantage and then take that recognition to the next level and not just sit back and be like, oh, I have all these advantages because I'm white, but really say, okay, what is my individual obligation to take that a level higher and to work towards changing the system that makes it easy for me to be complacent and easy for me to sit back and take a break and just sort of opt in to any discomfort or any negativity that I may be feeling.
Thank about quite a bunch, and maybe we'll come up again in the session, is just this notion of the opt-in, opt-out, but also the human neutrality. Like we just pass for what is quote unquote normal, and therefore have this degree of privilege when it comes to these discussions. And so holding ourselves accountable, kind of coming back to Julia's formulation, becomes even more important. And you know, it's essential that we sit with the discomfort you've kind of identified. So thank you. Our last discussant is Dr. David Rosenthal, a faculty member in the Department of Mathematics and Computer Science. And David, the question for you is, can you talk about a time when white privilege was evident to you?
Thank you. So I'm a white middle-aged man. I guess a light blue shirt with a tie, blue tie, and no hair on my head, but I have a reddish beard. So, like many people, of course, heavily influenced by my parents, who have always been committed to anti-racist work. In fact, that's how they met. And they raised my sisters and me in an environment that enabled us to develop diverse group of friends and to form deep bonds. And so as we grew up, we saw our friends being treated differently in various moments, being disciplined more harshly in school, say when we were all late, and I was not being treated as harshly as they were, or brilliant friends of mine who were discouraged from applying to certain universities because they were told it would be too difficult for them. And so I've tried to live my life in an anti-racist way, and I hope, of course, the people that have gotten to know me see that. But with the, in recent years, and in particular the recent months, there's been a call to action, and I feel that as well, and the need to do more. And this summer, I participated in a workshop online that was put together by Academics for Black Lives, which was really great, very intensive, lots of great stuff, including learning lots of, lots of history, learning about intersectionality, which was introduced by Kimberly Crenshaw, about understanding interlocking systems of oppression. But also there was a component on whiteness and thinking about white privilege, and a key part of that was very reflective, to be reflective. And that part, of course, is very difficult. And some of the things that came up that I thought about, one situation in particular, where one of my close friends, who's Black, we were roommates together for 4 years in college, and like lots of students in our 4th year, we decided to move off campus. And I can't remember exactly why, but I was up there a little early, so I was the one who went out and found us the place, and it was a really nice apartment. We were happy with it, and then at the end of the year, he was graduating, going off to medical school, and I was continuing for my graduate work there. And so I went back to that same realtor that I found that apartment with, figuring, okay, I'll find another nice one. And while I was sitting there looking over some papers, I can't remember if it was, paperwork I had to fill out, or if it were some apartments that we might go look at. At some point, he sort of says something like, so it's just going to be you, right? No roommate. And I said, no, yeah, he's graduated. So I need to find a place for myself that I can afford. He said, okay, good, because there were some questions about me. I don't know if he was involved with any drugs, or I don't know, coming home late a lot or something. And my quick reaction was just, no, of course not. But in that moment, of course, realizing that, the first time that I was shown the apartment, right, he doesn't know that my roommate was going to be Black. And so, the apartments he showed me, apparently he's making that clear. That's affected by that fact, and actually recognizing that if I choose to just navigate in that moment, let it slide, we go look at other apartments right then and there. And I'm grateful to my partner at the time. She was sitting next to me in that, and she leaned in and said, "Do you hear what he's saying?" And it helped me, snap out of that frozen state I was in, and to be present, to not let that moment pass, and to address it head on. And this work is never ending, right? Racism permeates everything in this country, it seems. And so, yeah, that moment is one of the ones that really stuck out to me.
Thank you, David. I'm thinking about some conversations that you and I have had as well, where you realize, and I'm guessing everyone in this session will recognize a version of this, because there's many different identities around which this happens, but were you being in a group of, let's say, other white people or other straight people, it really depends on the identity in question, but let's focus on whiteness here, find that people make assumptions about what you believe and then tell jokes or make other comments where you then have, I think it's incumbent on us to kind of step up. I forget what you said your partner did, called you in, but to almost call ourselves in, to interject and interrupt those assumptions about us, so that people do not imagine, other white people typically do not imagine that there is no one else in the room who actually, or that we all agree. And I know as a gay guy, like that happens in another valence with me, not that infrequently, where folks will kind of say something around me assuming I'm straight, and then I'm in that sort of uncomfortable position. But anyway, that's a side note. I just want to encourage people to put questions in the chat, because we very, very much want this discussion to be centered around your questions, and around what you're thinking. It could be related to the things that the discussants have already said, or entirely different things that are just kind of on your mind that we maybe didn't hit on. We have a couple of questions queued up, so I'll start with one of those, but we're really keen to hear what you have to say. So please, please, please take advantage of that chat feature. Okay, so the first question I have is, it's really going right at the heart of the topic, which is, what is it? When we're talking about this construct of whiteness, what is it? And how and why is it maintained in American society despite the ideals that Barack Obama talked about, that were proclaimed in our founding documents? And I'm going to turn it over to Caroline for a first response.
So thank you, Matt. That's a really great question and a really hard question to answer. So I will do my best to at least tap at it. So I think the construct of whiteness clearly is constructed, which means it's been built. It was built up by, so something doesn't get constructed on its own. The word alone means that there's someone or something behind the way something gets produced. So I think we need to keep that in mind when we're talking about the construct of whiteness, that it's not something that is a natural thing. We are not inherently white, although we've been led to believe that we are because of the societal norms, because of the political climate, because of the policies that we have all grown up with. So in that construct, it's kind of a mindset where people who have a certain skin pigmentation are somehow privileged over those who do not. And that privilege ekes its way into everything that happens in society and culture, in family and education. So yes, we have this the ideal in the founding documents of the country, but do we really? The founding documents were written by old white guys who really created those documents to protect themselves and their own institutions, which themselves were already part of this construct of whiteness. So I think we have to be really careful when we talk about the ideals in the founding documents, because what ideals are really there? The 3/5 clause is not really about equality. Who really got to participate in the government and the decision making? I know there's no photographs, but look at the paintings. They're all white guys in the room, and white men. So we have to be really careful when we lay our arguments down by the ideals of the founding documents, the ideals of our history, because I think then we're not really looking at that history closely.
Thank you. That's a really important point about what the document actually says, in addition to some of the things that we're kind of holding up. So I think that's key. And now, Joanne.
Yeah, I'm thinking of the work of Ibram X. Kendi, who visited our campus last year, the year before. And in his very, very major book, Stamped from the Beginning, The Definitive History of Racist Ideas, he points out that the ideas follow the behaviors and the actions. So, for example, we had slavery in America, right? That was a fact. People were enslaved, people were in prison. We had the genocide of the indigenous people. So there had to be a way to justify that. And the ideas, like the 3/5 policy and the valuing of white over other was something that was needed to really shore up our economic system, which depended on slavery. It's a very, very big book. He has a smaller book, How to Be Anti-Racist, that he's published more recently, and actually a middle school version of Stamped from the Beginning, which is an intensive work of scholarship. So I think that the ideas that we kind of see as our norms often are something that is justifying the way we constructed the society in order to say, well, it's okay. It's okay that we have slavery. It's okay that we have Jim Crow. It's okay that we have segregation. And we can look at all those decisions of the Supreme Court, and they were meant to shore up the status quo, which advantage and continues to advantage a certain group of people, which many of the other speakers have said. So that's my reflection on that at the moment. Thank you.
Sure, and there's a lot of great scholarship about the sort of invention of race, not the literal invention of pigment, which is often where I think people incorrectly understand or maybe, intentionally misunderstand what people are saying here. No one's inventing pigment. We're talking about race as a social construct as distinct from that. There's lots of great scholarship. It's easy to find if you want to Google anyone in this session to learn more about how that happened and how we sort of created Blackness as sort of a means of justifying many actions that were already well in progress. So, by the way, we are starting to get some questions, and just talking to the panel here, so I may actually pivot between the questions we're getting and the ones we'd kind of thought about in advance. But I'm going to go to one of the questions we thought about in advance first. In the first session, Dr. Beverly Green defined racism, and I thought that was just in a way that I thought was just so precise and taught. She said, racism is a structured inequity, and racism doesn't require racists in order to work because it's written into the structures, and I'm thinking Alinda here too, and the rules of the game. So if you do nothing other than play by the rules, you may generate racist outcomes without necessarily accepting, at least consciously, a racist ideology. So the question that came out of this for us was, how can we shift the culture toward more just outcomes? And I know, David, you had some thoughts about that.
Yeah. So one of the things that this makes me think about are the discussions that come up around implicit bias, and some of the training about that we've received over the years, and how that fits in. And humans are pattern recognizers, right? And it's what makes us good at, identifying key situations in sports or games or research, mathematics. And it also, of course, then leaves us susceptible to being manipulated, right? It's why propaganda works. Of course, nobody wants to think that they are programmed, but we have to acknowledge the power of patterns that winds up getting into our filters. Right, we hear about in the quest to create self-driving cars, right? Turns out at one stage they're racially biased. They're not able to identify Black pedestrians correctly, right? How can that be possible? Well, clearly, the programmers, as they're feeding the training data into these machine learning algorithms, that data was biased, right? It goes back to that notion of what is sort of the average person, right? And of course, that relates to the proximity to whiteness. Dr. Natalie Byfield gave a really nice, from Sociology Department, St. John's, she gave a really, really great presentation about the Central Park 5 case about a year and a half ago. And in that presentation, one of the things that she was talking about over those decades, in the last several decades, the massive collection of data that came about during those stop and frisk policies. And of course, now, it's always been known to be racially biased, but even it's been acknowledged publicly in various ways, even by Bloomberg recently. But that data still gets used for so-called predictive policing, right? So if you have biased information, biased data in, you're going to get biased results coming out with devastating repercussions. And so if we only focus on the racist ideas, right, coming back to what Dr. Green was saying, without discussing the racist policies, without discussing the structures that exist that are rooted in white supremacy, that those ideas are used to support, then we'll continue to see racist outcomes. And at universities, we have a lot to examine. In many ways, universities are gatekeepers, and collectively, we need to look everywhere, frankly. As Dr. Green also said in in her comments in that first panel, this process won't be easy, right? The process of questioning what are the origins of one's beliefs. This is a difficult process, right? Questioning how things got into our filters. But the sort of classic response of, well, that's the way things have always been done in response to various things, that clearly can't be a way forward.
David, you were talking about that first panel, and I just want to, you mentioned that universities are gatekeepers, and Carlene Bennett made a really interesting point in that session too. Well, I mean, that universities are also socializing institutions. That, the very place where we sit is a place that also does the work of inculcating culture and cultural expectation and norms, and reifying certain ways of being as the norm or as superior. And that formulation also stuck with me, just as a way of conceptualizing why our role in universities is so critical, wherever we sit, whether we're students, educators, really just wherever we are in the institution. So Linda, I'm going to put you on the spot on this one, but I think it's a question you're ready for. So this is from the audience, but it's one we've all thought about. So please, others, feel free to jump in. So I'm white, at least the person writing. How can I talk to my white friends who tend to think white privilege isn't real, that it doesn't exist?
Oof. Okay. First, I want to recognize the difficult position that you're in when you're thinking about how to have that conversation. And I don't want to minimize that. And I don't want to minimize the discomfort that you feel in bringing this conversation forward and in furthering this. But with that, I also want to say that I think that you have to make the decision about how far out there are you willing to put yourself, and are you willing to sit in discomfort among your friends to further this point. And I think that you have to make the decision that the ultimate goal of dismantling white privilege has to supersede the discomfort you might feel with your friends. And that doesn't minimize the fact that you're going to feel discomfort and there's going to be disappointment and there's going to be some chafing. But I recently had a conversation with somebody who I'm Facebook friends with, and she said, how come so many of you are still friends with people who you know and who I see posting racist, sexist, awful things? Like, these are people that you don't see on an everyday basis. These are people who are not an everyday part of your life. Why are you still friends with them? The easiest thing in the world, the least difficult thing for you to do is to say to these people, I can't condone this. I can't be part of this. I have to walk away from this. Thank you, and unfriend. Like, why are you not taking that even minimal step to remove your tacit endorsement of these people from your life? And I think that the flip side of not talking to your friends is basically tacitly endorsing their worldview, which you know is incorrect. I would also say a way to do it is to find a personal story for yourself about maybe a time when you realized, like, oh, I didn't even realize I had this privilege. I didn't even realize like this X, Y, and Z happened to me. And it made me really think about, have you ever had anything like that happen to you? Has anything like that ever happened in your life? So try and bring it down to the personal, but also just recognize that the flip side of not having that conversation means that you're basically endorsing that worldview and you're letting it perpetuate. So you're not sort of taking that minimal step you need to take to help foster individual awareness. Now, what the person does with your conversation is their decision, but staying silent in that situation or not talking about it for fear of bringing discomfort is probably, I think, where many of us get tripped up and where many of us have the biggest problem is like, well, I don't want to say anything because I don't want to get so-and-so upset. But I think we have to stop coddling each other, and we have to stop coddling, like white people have to stop coddling each other. It's hard. And I don't mean to say that flippantly, but like, you can't keep coddling people. If your intention is to help people get to the point where they realize that something that is actually a thing is a thing, you can't coddle them through that. You have to be blunt, you have to be direct, you have to speak from your heart, and you have to just let that person deal with it the way that person's going to deal with it.
I think that's right. And I'll just say one other thing, which is that oftentimes in my conversations with white people, with my family and friends, that oftentimes they juxtapose the idea of what we call white privilege against the idea of hard work. And that's wrong. No one is suggesting that you didn't work hard. No one is saying you didn't have to work hard. That's not part of the story. And if you I think, disassociate those two things and say, look, I can give you all the credit in the world for working hard. And also we can acknowledge the fact that there were tailwinds behind you while there were headwinds in front of BIPOC folks, that if they can begin to see it that way, that we're not trying to take away from hard work, that is a real thing in the world. It is a totally different valence we're viewing this from. We're saying hard work and also, not no hard work, just whiteness. And we're also saying that, like, you know, by extension, clearly very hardworking BIPOC folks could maybe don't get as far precisely because they have the headwind and not the tailwind, if I'm using kind of travel metaphors here. Other folks want to jump on that one because it is kind of the critical question.
Hi, Matt, it's Joanne. I think a couple of things. First of all, I think what Linda said about, you know, putting yourself out there as an example of where you've slipped or you haven't made the effort. The second thing is I think you have to be mindful of how this is affecting yourself, right? So if you're meeting with an opposition and a resistance that's getting injurious to you, then I think you have to titrate how far you're gonna go in this conversation. You know, this may or may not be productive. And I think being thoughtful beforehand of how you might, you know, approach a conversation like this is really important. And also to have other allies, you know, to be in conversations like this where you know that people are trying to enter the space and to be thoughtful and mindful and moving in the right direction and learning, you know, really learning about the real history of who we are. So I think there's a number of things that we can all be preparing ourselves for these kinds of conversations, which are all around us if we wish to engage. And sometimes it isn't the smart thing to engage, and you have to judge that with each encounter.
So Matt, I'm going to try to answer the question
Please.
Very quickly, even though it's not a quick answer. So 3 pieces of advice to have these conversations with white people to white people. Educate yourself as to what is the history, what is going on, what has happened, what's happening now. So arm yourself with education. Second thing, do your own work. So you have to be authentic in these conversations. And that comes across when you're speaking to someone, if you're challenging them with just quotes or things that you're repeating from somebody else, doesn't come off as authentic. So be authentic. And in order to do that, you have to do your own work about who you are and your own implicit biases and how you can be an anti-racist. And my third suggestion is don't give up, because you can peck somebody to death. And sometimes a little hammer is more efficient than a great big bulldozer. So you're not going to win everybody over the first time you have a conversation. So, you know, keep at it, don't give up, be persistent, and don't back down.
I have a kind of a follow-up question to this, but I'm gonna hold it for now just to get to, because I think there's a good question for Victoria in here too that's tied, which is, you know, this idea of the political divide in the country. And I don't know whether this ties into the writer's question precisely, but maybe. You know, we tend to think that, like, folks who are on the same side of discussion that we are as discussants and moderator today belong to one side of the political divide and everybody else is on the other. Like, how do we offer space for all people, independent of their political beliefs, to join the conversation authentically and feel like they have room in it, assuming they actually want to learn and make progress?
Right. When I look at our society right now, I see it as fractured, but I also have this recognition that our human rights are ultimately connected to our political systems. Like, that's a global thing, but especially here in the United States, when you think of like suffrage, civil rights, LGBTQ, all this expansion of our democracy ultimately comes down to policy. And so while the upcoming election is super important, you know, and who gets elected, we have to look at the implications of what that specific person means, and the trickle effects beyond just one president. And it's alarming to consider all the different places of implication in our world and where unjust policy currently meets specifically the Black community. When we think of poverty, when we think of the justice system, there's a lot that goes into it. But what's required of each of us is to really discern, what our place in this political system is, not just in one vote every 2 or 4 years, not just for one particular office. But I really, I think too in justice work, it's often like, oh, well, what do you do? Like, I encourage you to vote. You should vote. Like, yes, voting's important, but how politically engaged are you? Do your local elected officials actually know you by name? Do they know like your face? Do your senators, like, have they heard of your constant like calls for whatever it is that is important to you? If there's not that relationship there, you're not correctly politically engaged. And while an online petition might be effective, while a call or a tweet are forms of advocacy, yes, all political strategists agree that the ultimate form of doing advocacy work, the best approach, the best method is to have in-person meetings with elected officials. And so when we talk about systems and structures of inequity and of racism, it's all these components. It's not just like the one end all be all, one office. It's knowing all these different places of our political engagement where we should be. Even right now during COVID and the pandemic, a lot of offices are holding virtual meets and town halls. So do all the people who are your elected officials in the political system who are making policy, do they know you? And are you speaking out specifically against that are real? And understanding our interconnectedness with one another. Ultimately, if Black community is suffering right now, I'm suffering too. This is really the work that we are all called to, this political engagement on a constant basis. It's a real responsibility we have.
Thank you. And I think it is tricky right now. We're seeing lawn signs go up in our neighborhoods, and it triggers emotions, probably whichever side of the divide you're on. But at any rate, like I think in talking to lots of white folks, they'll kind of say to me, I feel like I can talk to the person who's, and it gets back to the questioner's comment. I could talk to the folks who are already on my side, but the ones who aren't, I just can't find the space for it. And then I think of Joanne's point about like where and how do you interject and how do you also keep yourself safe? There's just so much involved in this while also jumping in to kind of Linda's point and making sure you're not sitting it out. It's a lot, and we're not trying to suggest that it isn't for sure. So we're not saying this is easy. One thing, by the way, we're still looking, we would love to get more audience questions. Please, by all means, we'll just keep putting them in, or if you have clarifications or like that point requires more detail, just let us know. I will say that those of you who are curious about the materials that have been referenced in the session, we'll get those in the notes afterward. So I'm not going to ask the panelists to actually say specifically, give a bibliography, but we'll make sure that you get that information later on. So a question that's on my mind when I think about Bob Fanuzzi at the first session, and even some of the comments that have come up today, is the role of kind of ethnicity in some of these conversations. That, when you think about white people saying that like they don't understand white privilege, a lot of times what I find latent in those discussions, or over, it depends, is to do that. Well, my ancestors, first of all, had nothing to do with this system called slavery. They came way after that. And also they came with $3 in their pocket. And so therefore, I am not implicated in this system. Why do I have to spend time thinking or defending or anything in this space? Does anyone have thoughts about that? Because I actually feel ethnicity plays a pretty dramatic role, and that came up a few times in the last sessions.
I don't remember who said this. It was somebody in a talk someplace about why is it that people who've struggled through those things, the ethnic discrimination and things like that, why don't they feel like a compatibility or a recognition or a sympathy with people who are struggling with that kind of thing now? Why does it turn into, like now I've made it, so now I'm not going to pay any more attention? So why aren't there like women who fought for gender equality and ethnic groups that have fought for, equality in their time? Why does that not build a stronger connection to people who struggle now? And I just put that out there as a question because it really, really impacted me when I heard that. I wish I could remember who said it.
So Isabel Wilkerson wrote the book Caste, and she has a whole chapter about this. And she talks she actually speaks directly at the point where people say, well, I wasn't here, my ancestors weren't here. This is not my problem. And her point is, she talks about buying a house. And you buy a house and the house has issues. Maybe the floors are warped, maybe the windows need replacing. You can't say, well, I didn't build the house, it's not my problem. It's now your house. You have to fix the problem. And I think that's a really profound, simple way of saying, we've inherited this, whether our families have been here for hundreds of years or hundreds of days. This is now our house. It's our responsibility to fix the house, rebuild the house, make sure that the house stands and is strong. I just think it's a really, really clear metaphor for this situation, this response that people give.
And I just want to sort of tag on to this with ethnicity, because I think like part of, again, my family narrative of being immigrants, like I didn't understand until much later how much we centered our ethnicity at the expense of talking about our whiteness. And again, I think to Matt's point, like all with the best of intentions. I mean, if you talk to my father, who is a really, I mean, honestly, like a really wonderful man, and truly believes like he is, you know, social justice warrior, and I think in his heart of hearts he wants to be, but he has a really hard time sort of getting past that point about privilege, because he thinks of his own personal upbringing where he was so poor and had so little, and there was so much discomfort in his personal upbringing. And I was so conscious of myself as an Italian American growing up, to the point where, so I went to college at an extremely white college, like very, very rare to see any Black or non-Black people of color there. So much so that I was actually interviewed for a book or a senior project on interracial friendships, because I was very good friends with a Black woman, and this woman was doing a research project on interracial friendships at this college, because it was such a white college, right? And I remember going for my interview with the researcher, who was Black, and she asked me a question that was like something as a white student, and I sort of was like, white? I'm Italian. Like what? Like it was like I was sort of so not used to hearing myself referred to as white or thinking of myself as white, because my family narrative was so much about the Italian American part that we just glossed over, I think to our collective detriment, the whole part of it where we're white, and what that meant, and how that gave us opportunities, even with the struggle of the immigrant experience and the immigrant story, like we were still white. And it took that moment, like I was truly, like I remember I had a physical reaction. I was like my head kind of turned, and I was like, I'm not white, I'm Italian American. And then I was like, oh, you idiot, yes, you're white. Like, yes, of course you're white. So I think that the ethnicity part was so centered because there was so much pride around being a sort of high achieving member of that ethnicity and being a high achieving immigrant family, that I just never took the time to really sit with the fact that my Italianness was very much tied to also my whiteness.
You know, I'm just going to say one thought that comes to my mind, and then we're actually going to go to our last question, which is kind of takeaways and next steps, is that, you know, whenever I think about this question myself, and I had a similar upbringing, although a couple of generations removed from Linda's, but, you know, it's like you can't opt out of white privilege. You can't say, well, I'm a different kind of white. That doesn't work like that, any more than a BIPOC person could say, I'm going to opt out of the system of oppression. It doesn't work like that. And so saying that I was not historically involved, well, first of all, likely you were, but that's a longer story. But more precisely, this is not a choice you get to make. We benefit whether we want to or not consciously. You know, I also just want to answer a question. I have a response from the committee. So the question was, why is this panel largely or entirely comprised of white people, excuse me, aside from the folks who introduced us? And I just want to read their response. So we felt it's important for white folks to have the opportunity to deeply engage this conversation directly. BIPOC folks talk about this all the time, teach about this, experience it for centuries. The construct of whiteness versus blackness, which is the usual US binary, and has its problems, is a concept and construct created by those who were and are in power structurally, meaning white, male, cisgender, people with wealth or property. So we thought it'd be really powerful to demonstrate for our audience, who is primarily white, how they can deepen their awareness and hopefully actively dismantle the construct of whiteness within ourselves and our world. So there's also, by the way, been a bunch of other questions. Just FYI, thank you, thank you, thank you. We will not be able to get to them today, but we will pick them up later. So my sort of summative question for you, and everyone should have about 2 minutes or so, is, and this is phrased polemically. The question is, what does a white anti-racist movement look like? And answer to that question, I'm going to pick up Doctor in Training Sherrod Tomlinson's comments from the first session, which is where he pointed out that we have to have class in efforts to disrupt racism. And just to go back to that acronym, C, clear your mind of what you've been taught about other groups of people. L, listen to stories of other people, their traumas, their experiences. A, attend to conversations around you, including places where microaggressions may be taking place. S, surround yourself with people from different walks of life. Second S, study and be scholarly, get to know the history and research of other communities, perhaps even your own, by the way, but certainly those different from your own. So coming back to the key question here, what does a white anti-racist movement look like? Again, we recognize it's a polemical phrasing. I'm going to start it with David.
Well, there are a couple quick things. So, in particular, the study and scholarly aspect of class, I think that's incredibly important. We are at a university, after all. This is what we are expected to engage in, and so, that relates to like the previous question in terms of folks who feel like, I don't need to participate in this. I worked hard, to understand the history, the targeting of Black communities, the terrorizing, right, by understanding redlining and other practices that continue, which prevent that from happening in the same way as other communities. But in terms of moving forward, my feeling is always that it's collective. It needs to be collective. That means white folks need to be present, need to listen, and to fulfill that full acronym. So in particular, been fortunate to be part of some of the activities at the Academic Center for Equity and Inclusion, and both from the subcommittee that I'm on, which is led by Dr. Sharon Marshall, who's done a phenomenal job, and of course the director, Dr. Marusha Casmiel, who's been phenomenal, and her leadership is greatly appreciated. One thing that I'm struck by most there is the framing of how to have conversations, developing of community norms, people coming together who are asked to get to their comfort level +1, and to engage in that class acronym, but then also to identify actionable goals. And it's a very powerful feeling. There's the initial part of, with all this questioning of oneself, which is uncomfortable at various times and difficult, but collectively we have strength. And to me, that's the way we move forward, and in particular at this university.
Thank you. Linda.
Okay, so I think there's sort of two things that I think a white anti-racist movement looks like. I think the number one thing is to take individual accountability and get to the point where that individual accountability compels you to call out the system. And to do this on your own, and I'm going to come back to a common theme, without having to be coddled and without expecting, frankly, like a ticker tape parade when you do it. Do that work. Do that work on your own. If you find groups of like-minded other white people who you can do the work with, do that work. Don't make people prove to you that there is an issue, because that takes time and energy away from the real work that has to be done, because this is just part of the work. This is the work that white people have to do so that we can help do the real work and share some of the burden and carry some of the responsibility, because that's really what has to happen for white people to sort of get past this point of needing to have proof that there's a problem. So that's part one. The other one's a little more personal for me. I'm a parent to a 4-year-old, and I think that that's an opportunity. I see that as a gift that I have, to help my daughter understand certain things that it took me much longer to understand than it should have, to talk with her more frankly, to think about What is she reading? What is she exposed to? What are we talking to her about? Let's have really direct conversations about race, about racism. And there's something really beautiful about having to have those conversations with a 4-year-old, which sounds weird, but when you have to speak to a 4-year-old, you have to simplify things, and you have to distill things down to their core and to their essence. And so it gives me the opportunity to really crystallize my thinking and come to new understandings on my own, because I have to get a kid to understand them. I had to get my 4-year-old to understand what was happening in a health pandemic. And that was hard. But that also gave me confidence, because I realized I can now talk to her about the pandemic of racism. It's not as hard as I thought it was. And they make more connections than you think they're going to make. So that's the other work that I think, if you have the opportunity to mold the next generation of white people in some meaningful way, take that opportunity and think about what you wish you would have realized sooner, and help those people in your life get to that point a little sooner than you did, so that they can be informed by your learning and avoid some of the mistakes you've made.
Thank you. And I think the molding the next generation part, super germane at a university, for sure. So Victoria.
I think it's providential in a sense that today in the Catholic tradition, we celebrate the feast of St. Peter Claber, who was, a white Spaniard who was sent to Colombia in the 1600s and wound up spending over 30 years working towards abolition. And so what made him effective in his work, and why he's held as a justice worker in our faith tradition, hundreds of years later, is that he took time for prayer to dedicate and really be intentional about what God was calling him to do. So whether you are a faith-filled person or a person of goodwill, I recommend that you set aside that time for yourself, to have moments of quiet, to also recognize your places of influence, the people in your circles, what exactly would make you most effective. I mean, my approach to anti-racism work as a campus minister, and knowing my family and my surroundings, is going to be different from, say, a faculty member on this call who lives in another part of the city. So we really need to look at our own selves, understand our surroundings, our context, and be intentional about what our anti-racism work, how it can be most effective. And I think setting aside that time for discernment is helpful.
Thank you. And Caroline.
Thanks, Matt. So I think we need to be willing to lean into this uncomfortableness to a point where it's no longer uncomfortable, because it's part of what we do as individuals and as a society. And how do we get to that place? I think we need to do our own work. I think we need to go beyond doing this internal dialogue, these conversations. I think we need to turn the conversation into action, a very Vincentian thing, right? We know what the problem is. Now, what are we going to do about it? And a white anti-racist movement would incorporate white privilege into making the changes. So what we need to do is take or make use of our own white privileges to change the systems that already exist.
Thank you. And Joanne.
I'll just add, because I agree with what everyone has said about assuming the responsibility for our own education and for building community. But also a word that often gets used is this idea of hope. You can't do this kind of work without strengthening and maintaining hope. And that doesn't mean that you become an optimist thinking everything is going to be okay. I heard somebody define it as a commitment to continue to do the work despite what the results are and despite what happens. You have to have a commitment. And I think that's sometimes difficult, but it's so essential to maintain and build hope.
So I'm just going to say a couple of quick concluding remarks, then I'm going to turn it over to Julia to actually close up. But I just want to say again that if you submit questions we didn't get to, we may use them in future conversations or discussions. So keep your eyes peeled for those, and also please be sure to come to the future sessions. Thank you to the discussants, both for today and for all the work that went into it, and again to those who put this together. I just want to take a quote from actually Manushka Casagnol's email signature, because I think it does a great job of kind of summarizing a lot of what we're talking about here, which is it's by the Indigenous Australian artist, activist, and educator, Dr. Lila Watson. And the quote is, "If you come here to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you've come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together." I think that's critical. These conversations are also about liberating white people, whether we recognize it or not. The system does harm to us all. And that maybe is a longer discussion for another day, but we appreciate your being here today with us to get it started. So I'm now going to turn it over to Julia. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Putrelli, Dr. Carroll, Ms. Fuchs, Ms. O'Keefe, Ms. Romano, and Dr. Rosenthal for leading this conversation. And thank you to all of the 158 attendees for joining today's session. It's a really good number. From what we've heard today, we've heard that being anti-racist is essential. And being anti-racist means remaining accountable and aware of what actions must be taken, what policies and what structures must be changed, and why reflecting on privilege must be a consistent and continuous effort in order to understand the changes that must take place to achieve social justice. I want to quote Dr. Rosenthal twice. Dr. Rosenthal, you said two things today that I think must be repeated. You said racism permeates everything. And you also said, if we continue to discuss racist ideas without discussing racist policies and racist structures, we will continue to see racist outcomes. And Ms. Romano, I also want to quote you. You also said two things today that I think need to be repeated. You said, this is just part of the work. And you also said, we will not accept the violent outputs of this system. So I feel like that's something that I'm going to reflect on, and everyone else should reflect on as well, especially when we want to think about what will each of us do when this conversation ends. And just another reminder that it's a plan that unanswered questions will be gathered and addressed in future conversations. The video of this session will be posted a week from today and can be rewatched and shared with others. So the website link is stjohns.edu/racialjustice. The next topic is the construct of racialized trauma. That's going to happen in 2 weeks on Wednesday, September 23rd at 1:50 p.m. And please take a few minutes to fill out the short event feedback survey. The survey will appear once you click to exit the session. And all series information, details about future sessions, and the recordings can be found at stjohns.edu/racialjustice. Thank you, everybody, for coming today, and please be safe.